Hello, I am Raj Vedam, and this talk is titled When Ideas Collide, the Story of Indian History. So, I'd like to address the question of why is Indian history distorted? So today we find that there are several forces impinging on our narrative of history. We have the liberal academic bias that brings in a certain kind of narrative in today's history using postmodernism and things of that nature. We have got the Marxist perspective on Indian history that brings in another kind of perspective on our history. We have vested interests, the media, in other powerful institutions, let us say, who have a vested interest in bringing in a certain kind of Indian history. Then we have the Eurocentric narrations, which require the notion of a homeland for the Europeans, and that has also impinged on the narration of Indian history. And finally, the earliest of all of these things, a colonial perspective. When the colonial people came to India, they had a certain way of looking at Indian history. So the bottom line is that the early colonial historians were motivated by a desire to uphold biblical chronology, and we'll look at that in just a minute. The linguistic analysis of Indo-European languages, that required that there be a Proto-Indo-European homeland in Central Asia, and that is the one that led directly to the Aryan Invasion theory. As a consequence of that, the Dravidians were positioned as different from the North Indians to facilitate the missionary desire to convert the Southern Indians. And the Marxists obviously desired to subvert the Indic identity. So I try to bring in an evidence-based narration when we talk about Indian history. To me, I look at every one of the narratives in the context of a model. So I ask, what should a good model have on Indian history? So ideally, we would like a good model to accommodate all available evidence coherently with little or no conflict. So in other words, if we have some finds coming in from archaeology or finds from genetics or maybe from climate records, or when we read epigraphy or we read coins or paleontology or paleobotany or archaeometallurgy or even archaeoastronomy, looking at literature, old records, foreign traveler accounts, the timelines of different histories of the world, the sciences, scripts, grammar, language, religion, philosophy, arts, cuisine, you name it. There's a whole lot of evidence that we have, and a good model should accommodate these things coherently. There should not be much of a conflict. We also know if a model is good, it should be used to predict. Sometimes we have some gaps in our understanding. Maybe the archaeological record is not complete. So a good model should be able to predict coherently. It should not make very wild extrapolations. So that is what we would like in a good model on Indian history. So today, the dominant model that we are using in Indian history is one of the Aryan invasion or the Aryan migration theory. And we need to understand this model, how it came about, and what are the implications of this model. So early Europeans who made use of the Proto-Indo-European linguistic model, that led them to propose that the homeland for the speakers of these languages, the ancestor of these languages, was somewhere in Central Asia. And this thinking, this model, led to the thinking that there's got to be an Aryan invasion theory, which today is called an Aryan migration theory, approximately around 1500 BCE from Central Asia. And as an implication of this theory, we have that Sanskrit and Hinduism is an import into India, and that the Dravidians are a separate people. So if we look at the evidence, we see that the linguistic model has been used to propose all of these things. And the linguistic model, today when people talk about genetics, we observe that the constraints used for the genetic model makes use of known ideas from linguistics. So in other words, a circular argument. So I claim that the genetics evidence is made to fit the linguistic model. So it's not really an independent line of evidence coming, but rather it has got constraints that are taken from the linguistic model. We also see that there is evidence that does not fit the linguistic model. Things like astronomy, archaeology, oral literary works, the climate record, these are all evidences that we can show does not fit the linguistic model, leading us to ask what can be a better model for Indian history. So let me go through the various forces that have impinged on Indian history and try to analyze some of these ideas. The first idea we'd like to talk about is India a young civilization or is it an ancient one? That's the first question to address. So I'd like to show that the biblical chronology imposed a young chronology for India as seen by the early colonial scholars. So when we look at colonial narration of Indian history, we know that people like William Jones. So he came to India approximately late 1700s, and he was a scholar of Latin and Greek. He came to India, he studied Sanskrit, and to his amazement, he found this commonality between these languages. At least there are some words that appear to be common. So he proposed that these people were all related, and thereby was born the idea of Aryans. Now, another thing that William Jones did was he wanted to write an early history of India, looking at the history of India. So he was one of the primary people who also looked at these things. He looked at the Puranic chronology. The Puranic chronology gave a history of Indian kings starting from the grandson of the Pandavas, going all the way down to the Gupta kings. Now, when he and other colonial historians took a look at the Puranic king list, it surprised them because they could not figure out where does Indian history begin and where does it end in relation to Western history. There was no anchor point. They needed to find an anchor point where they could say, aha, we know what's going on over here. And looking at the Puranic chronology, it appeared that Indian history was going back to enormous timelines which they couldn't comprehend or even want to admit. So the first fortunate thing for them was to look for Megasthenes' account of Sandrakutos. So phonetically, they plumbed the Puranic king list and said that there's somebody called Chandragupta Maurya, and he probably is Sandrakutos, and they made an anchor point for Indian history, saying that this is the anchor point, and everybody was happy. The only downside is the Puranic king list put Chandragupta Maurya approximately maybe 1200 years earlier than 300 BCE, which was supposed to be the timeline for Megasthenes and Sandrakutos and so on. So in essence, by making such a synchrony, they introduced distortions in the Puranic genealogy. And until such time, if you take a look at Kota Venkatachalam's books, he says that Puranic chronology matched perfectly with the Nepal king list, with the Kashmir king list, and so on. But after the colonial historians were done with their rewriting of Puranic genealogy, the synchrony was lost. So even today, there is irreconcilable. We can't even try to say where does Indian history begin and end as far as this is concerned. So we also know that the colonial historians were motivated to uphold biblical history. The Bible, according to popular thinking in that period of time, said that God created the world in 4004 BCE, and they arrived at that date by looking at the Old Testament and trying to add up the various prophets and the various people mentioned, and generation by generation, they worked back and said God created the world in 4004 BCE. And also they believed that God destroyed the world in 3000 BCE, Noah's flood, and because of which there cannot be a history of India that goes back to such a great period of time. So they looked upon the great chronology in the Indian context as requiring the white man's burden, literally, to try and correct the chronological problems of Indian history. So that led to an entire new industry, if you will, to rewrite Indian history. And we also know about Max Muller, who dated Vedas to the first millennium BCE on the basis of linguistic analysis. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the thinking of the colonial historians. When we say that they came with the ideological offensive, we need to provide some evidence for that. And William Jones, he said, either the first 11 chapters of Genesis are true, or the whole fabric of our national religion is false. He said this in a work called The Gods of Italy, Greece, Italy, and India in Asiatic Research in 1788. He also said in another work that I'm obliged, of course, to believe the sanctity of venerable books of Genesis in the chronology of Hindu Asiatic researches in 1790. And Max Muller, he said, I look upon the creation given in Genesis simply historical in an address in a letter in Oxford in 1875. So these accounts tell us that these early colonial historians came with a very desire to uphold biblical history. So we can rebut this idea very easily today using science. We know that today there are cosmological models which suggest a Big Bang event approximately 13.8 or 14 billion years ago that led to today's development of galaxies and stars and planetary systems. We also know that there are geological studies that show plate tectonics and continental shaping over billions of years. Today we know paleontology is showing very early fossils of dinosaurs and earlier animals from 100 million years ago and even earlier. So all these things disprove the assertion that Earth was created in 4004 BCE. There's also no evidence of a catastrophic flood in 3000 BCE leading to a major extinction of life. So we can say that the colonial ideological model is disproved by modern science. So the next model that we need to take a look at is the linguistic model. So the linguistic model was born out of a desire to see where is the homeland for the Indo-European people. So early on they thought perhaps India is the homeland. But later, a couple of things happened. One is the discovery of the Mitannis and the Hittites with the supposed Indo-Iranian Aryan connections in the late 1800s. And the second is the Indian War of Independence. Once the Indian War of Independence happened, then the British took over the administration of India from the East India Company, and they had a vested interest in looking at Indians as subjects and not the subject of exalted write-up. So the way they addressed topics of India or Indians changed before 1850 and after 1850. So one of the consequences of such Eurocentric thinking is the homeland also shifted for the Proto-Indo-European people. So in this timeline, a lot of linguistic analysis was done by German scholars, by other European scholars, and various timelines are proposed, and various homelands are proposed, and finally the homeland settled on Central Asia. And a consequence of that model was Aryans had to be in India in 1500 BCE if that linguistic model was right. Then in early 1900s, the Indus Valley Civilization came to prominence. And the theory became that there was an Aryan invasion from the Proto-Indo-European homeland. And one of the reasons they said was there were some skeletons found in Mohenjo-daro. And they said these skeletons are evidence that there was an invasion. Excuse me. So these early ideas were done using linguistics and archaeology. So today in 2000s, this invasion theory has become a migration theory from the Proto-Indo-European homeland, and people use linguistics, archaeology, and genetics to address some of these questions. So if we look at the Proto-Indo-European model, which is really a quest for the Western identity narrative, it says that there is a hypothesized ancestral language called Proto-Indo-European, from whom are derived a lot of other languages like this Balto-Slavic, the Germanic, Celtic, Italic, Hellenic, Indo-Iranian, and Iranian and Indic. And from Indic you have Sanskrit and the northern Indian languages. So people made use of something called comparative method in linguistics using internal reconstruction based on common keywords for various, the Swadesh list, if you will, to try and understand these things. And the fact that languages seem to change in a certain way implied a migration or a diffusion. So as one example of Proto-Indo-European reconstruction, I'd like to present the example of the wheel. So if you look at the bullock carts that are used in India even today, we find a picture of the wheel, a similar kind of wheel, even in Mohenjo-daro and Harappa from 2600 BC and so on. And if you look at the bullock cart, you have the wheel, you have the hub, you have the axle, and you have the yoke, and these are the kind of things that are there in it. And so we imagine that there were words to describe this technology even in the earliest languages. So I have here a table that shows Old Sanskrit, Latin, Greek, Hittite, and Tocharian, and words for wheel, yoke, hub, and axle, and we can see how these words change. For example, the word wheel, in Old Sanskrit, we use the word chakra. In Latin, the word was rotem, very close rotate, and in Greek, it was kuklos, and so on in Hittite and Tocharian. For the yoke, the word was yoga in Old Sanskrit, and lugam in Latin, and dugo, if I'm pronouncing it right, in Greek, and so on. For axle, the Sanskrit word was aksa, and in Latin it was axis. So at the bottom, I've given a proposed reconstruction, and the early linguists said that the word, Sanskrit words chakra, was derived from the earlier ancestor, Sanskrit's ancestor in Proto-Indo-Iranian called kekro. Wherever you see the star in the word, it means it's not a real word, it's a reconstructed word. And that Proto-Iranian word, Indo-Iranian word, was derived from the ancestor language called PIE, and it was, I cannot even pronounce it, I think it was Kweklo. So Kweklo led to Kekro, led to Sanskrit chakra. So this is a proposed reconstruction. However, it's ironic that the only evidence for this reconstruction is present in Sanskrit. Sanskrit provides the data for this reconstruction, and all these other words are not real, but they're just reconstructed words. So one of the breakthroughs, the linguistic model, was a so-called Kenton-Satem classification. So early on, by investigating, for example, for the word 100, 100 is shatam, looking in Avestan, they said it is satam, and they observed that it became kentum in Latin. So the ka became sha in Sanskrit, and the ka became a hard K in Greek or a H, ha, in Germanic. So these kind of observations led them to classify the various languages in terms of kentum and satem, and we see that from India, Indo-Aryan, to the Iranian, Armenian, to the Baltic, Slavic, all these people spoke the so-called Satem languages, whereas to the northeast of India, which is Tocharian, was a Kentum language, as also the Germanic, Celtic, and other Italic languages were also the so-called Kentum languages. And this provided a breakthrough aha moment for linguistics, who said that this shows a diffusion and migration path, and the fact that these languages have evolved in this manner suggested several waves of migration out of the Proto-Indo-European homeland. So today, if you look at the Indo-European language expansion, we find there are two dominating narratives, and one of them is a Kurgan steppe hypothesis by Maria Gimbutas, who in 1950s said the Indo-European expansion happened in three waves. So she said between 4000 BCE to 1500 BCE, with the invention of the horse and the wheeled chariot and iron swords and implements, the people were able to leave the Proto-Indo-European homeland and go out to the rest of the world. In contrast was the Anatolian hypothesis by Professor Colin Renfrew in 1987, who said that the Indo-European language expansion followed the invention and the spread of agriculture in 6500 BCE. And for today, some people seem to prefer the Kurgan or the steppe hypothesis. So let's look a little deeper into what the Kurgan or the steppe hypothesis is. And this talks about how in 3500 BCE, there was a wave of migration with the domestication of the horse. So people between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, the so-called Yamnaya people who left this part of the world. And once again, it's important to emphasize this is not the story of civilization, because in that period of time, you already had the Harappa people. In India, you had Birana, you had Merkar, you had Bimbetka, you had Lothal, you had Edekal. In Sumeria, you had civilization over there. Egypt, you had a civilization. In China, you had a civilization. So it's not the story of civilization as much as it is the story of who are the Indo-European people. So by 2500 BCE, the theory states that these people have migrated out to the west, becoming the beakerware, the corded-ware people, and to the east, becoming the Andronovo people. And by 1500 BCE, you see the appearance of people called the Hittites, Mycenaeans, Babylonians, and the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex. And you also see them entering into the tail end, into Sindh in India, which is the beginning of the Aryan invasion theory for us. By 500 BCE, these people have become, the Indo-Aryans have entrenched themselves in the Ganga plain, and we see the appearance of a people called Dravidian. So this would be the modern restatement of the so-called Aryan invasion or migration hypothesis. So formally, we call this out by saying bands of male warriors from Central Asia either invaded or migrated to India around 1500 BCE, and they effectively replaced the existing civilization, and they brought an entirely new Vedic religion, Sanskrit language, and a Vedic ecosystem. So today, this has become a much bigger story since the colonial scholarship. It is rooted in the quest for the Western identity. We also have collision with the Marxist ideological ideas. So the Marxists have an interest in continuing with this thinking because they have come about with the idea that the Indus Valley civilization is disconnected from India and bears no relationship to the civilization that came henceforth, who turn out to be the Vedic invaders. They disregard the internal sources. They have got postmodernism lenses such as oppressor-oppressed models, and they adopt that to view all of social dynamics in India, selectively pushing a very shallow, distorted view. Today, the minority sentiments are privileged, and invasive periods of invasion Indian history is whitewashed, and imagined atrocities of Indic rulers is manufactured. And this we have found when we reviewed the state textbooks used in Telangana and Andhra Pradesh and other such places. We find such a narrative over there. So today, distortions, erasures, biases, errors, misrepresentations, these are the hallmark of the current narrative, and you cannot build national identity with such enormous distortions. So we'd like to call out what is the collision of ideas in Indian history. We see that in this table, I have a mainstream narration and an evidence-based narration. The mainstream narration says there was an Aryan invasion theory. However, the evidence seems to show there is an out-of-India theory. Mainstream narration says Indic thought only impacted the countries to the east of India, which means China, Japan, Korea, Southeast Thailand, Cambodia, Southeast Asia, and so on. But the evidence shows Indic thought impacted the east as well as the west. The mainstream says Indic civilization is recent. After the isolate of Harappa, we had to wait 1,000 years before Magadha is counted as a civilization, and so on. However, the evidence shows that the Indic civilization is very ancient, and we will talk about some evidence for this. The mainstream tells us that Indic thought borrowed from the Greeks and Babylonians. However, the evidence shows Indic thought seeded the Greeks and Babylonians. We are told Indians are Aryans and Dravidians, but then we see the evidence shows identities are manufactured. We are told that the Vedic culture is responsible for widespread poverty in India. However, we see that invasions are responsible for widespread poverty, and we'd like to see the evidence using astronomy, archaeology, and genetics. So I'd like to now provide a small rebuttal to the linguistic model. So we can deconstruct the linguistic argument using the works of Shrikant Telugu, who wrote these two books, Rig Veda and this book on early Indians. So Shrikant Telugu brings about some powerful arguments. So he says that the Mitannis and Cassites who had Vedic names, and they were long after the Indo-Aryan was extinct. He calls out the presence of Vedic people earlier than 1700 BCE, contrary to what the Indo-European migration model suggests. He also powerfully brings about the idea that names too have a chronology. Names are in fashion in a certain period of time and they go out of fashion in a certain period of time. So he uses the notion of the kingless in Mitannis and Cassites to impose a chronology upon them also by talking about the time period of those names. Then he brings about the idea that the Rig Veda books, the Mandalas 1 to 10, are not written sequentially, but books 2, 3, 4, 6, 7 are older, and books 1, 5, 8, 9, 10 are later. And he shows how the earlier books seem to have knowledge of the geography to the east of the Saraswati, and the later books seem to show knowledge to the west of Saraswati, implying east to west migration, contrary to the linguistic model which suggests a west to east migration. Then he calls out the assumption that Avesta and Rig Veda, they show commonality in the later books of the Rig Veda, but the expansion model suggests that they have split earlier. So he calls out that absurdity. Then he points out that the spoked wheel, it appears in 3000 BC in the archaeological record, but it finds mention only in the newer books of Rig Veda. So he suggests the idea that the new books of Rig Veda should be 3000 BCE, which is much earlier than the supposed Vedic entry into India. Finally, Shrikant Telugu makes a powerful argument saying that the Proto-Indo-European homeland should be in northwest India and not in Central Asia. So he accepts the linguistic model, but the difference that he says is that it's got to be in northwest India, the homeland, rather than in Central Asia. I'd like to also talk to you about Nicolas Casillas, who also talks about the linguistic model, and he says the Proto-Indo-European is much older than 3000 BCE, and he calls out the absurdity of attempting to reconstruct this when the intermediate languages don't have the data, we don't have data for that. He calls out that comparative linguistics, he calls it out as a failed model, and he says it cannot predict consistently. He calls out the absurdity of reconstructing Proto-Indo-European and using that as a basis for further analysis. In other words, you start with an assumption, then you somehow convert that into a fact and use that fact to infer future facts. He calls out the absurdity of that circular argument. Then he says that reconstructed Proto-Indo-Europeans initially favored the Sanskrit language, but after the idea that there was an Aryan invasion theory, it distanced itself from Sanskrit and put a couple of layers of abstraction between Sanskrit and the Proto-Indo-European language. And he makes a very strong claim in this article in India Facts and Fallacies of Proto-Indo-European. He says, in my view, all the mainstream academic publications on the subject of reconstructing the Proto-Indo-European are worthless. Very, very strong words by Nicolas Casillas. So far, what we have done is we tried to analyze the problems with Indian history. We said we have a collision of ideas over here. So the early ideas, what we call the mainstream, were composed of ideas that came from the colonial ideological perspective, the left liberal bias in universities, the Marxist bias, as well as the Eurocentric bias. All of these things have given us a mainstream narration of Indian history. Then we have embarked on a process of deconstructing some of these narrations and trying to see where is the evidence taking us. We talked about the Aryan Invasion theory, and we talked about two scholars, Nicolas Casillas and Shrikant Telugu, and what their impression of the linguistic model is.